Hi, good evening, students. I wanted to give you a little bit of feedback and guidance on your signature assignment, particularly for part four and leading up to it. So I'm going to go through the entire process. You've done several of the steps already, but lots of you did a great job, and some of you have a little bit of tweaking to do. So I wanted to kind of explain the entire process, more for your learning than just for the assignment. So let's go over a couple of things. All right. First, overview of the steps that you're going to go through when you're planning for students with moderate to severe disabilities utilizing standards-based instruction. How do you go about doing that, particularly where there's a large gap between what your student is able to show you that they know, or how they process information, and the grade level standard that can sometimes be extremely rigorous, even for typical students. So there's a couple of steps. First, we have to know the student and what their strengths are and where they struggle. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about a student so we can look at that. Secondly, you're going to look at the grade level standard. Just they're a 10th grader, so what does that 10th grade standard look like? When you look at all the standards, we're going to focus on the essential components of the standard and those standards that make the most sense to teach because they're the ones that are most used in adulthood. And then we're going to what we call trellis down. In other words, look at that whole strand all the way down the grade level. The numbers stay the same. I'll show you that in a second. Trellis down that standard to where the student is currently working instructionally, because most of the time those are prerequisite skills for the grade level standard. I'm going to show you that in a second. And then developed an instructional goal or objective. This is what I'm going to be teaching the student, that I'm going to be working on, that's related to that grade level standard. And then I'm going to determine the most appropriate instructional strategy. And in your final assignment, you're going to kind of explain why you selected that strategy, right? So let's take a look at my student. The first step is to know my student and what their strengths and are and where they struggle. So this student, it's not his real picture, it's just an internet photo, but I have a kid in my mind, so I'm going to tell you about Dionisio. We call him D. He's a 6th grader at Mills Elementary School. He spends most of his day in the special education classroom. And he has an intellectual disability that's relatively significant. He has limited communication. He uses mostly simple words, but he does have a reliable yes and no response. His language is hard to understand for those who are not familiar with him. He loves music and dancing. He's friendly, and he enjoys interacting with others, so much that if he feels like he's not getting a lot of attention, he might just select to toss a shoe across the room to get people's blood flowing and to get attention directed his way. His family enjoys going to church, and he can pick out some very basic signs or words like the boys' bathroom and his favorite places to eat. But other than that, he doesn't have a lot of reading skills or writing skills at this point. All right? So he's a 6th grader, so I'm going to look at my 6th grade standards and focus on the essential components of the standard and those standards that are most often used in adulthood. Now I'm going to skip a slide a second and show you a tool that I have been using, and I recommend it in my other class. This is an iPhone app. It can be used on an iPhone, iPad, and I'm sure it's available in Android as well. But it's called Common Core. It's right here. Hopefully you can see that. It's called Common Core. And when you open it up, it has every grade level standard broken down by topic. So math, language arts, and then every grade. So it's just a really handy, quick device. So I hit social studies, and then art history, and then 6th to 8th grades kind of lumped together. So if I look at this one right here, this is one of the standards, and I looked at all of the standards. So I'm going to pull it up here and kind of go through my process. When I looked at all of the standards that were available on my item here, I read through them, and thought, okay, of all of these standards, what are some standards that make the most sense? So the first standard was reading history. That's what the RH is, reading history. 6th through 8th grade. Point 1 was citing in specific contextual or textual evidence to support analysis of a primary and secondary source. Okay, I thought, and then the explanation is you read closely to determine what the text is saying explicitly. Now, my student isn't a reader yet, so it could be listening to text. We could do that, but citing text, I don't know. I'm not sure if that was super important. The next one you'll see here is 6-8.2, also in reading history, and it says determine the central idea of information in a primary or secondary source, provide an accurate summary of the source, distinct from prior knowledge or opinions. All right. And then the kind of big idea anchor standard, which you'll see goes all the way down to kindergarten, is determine the central idea of or theme of a text and analyze these developments, summarizing the key supporting details and ideas. Now, I'm thinking listening or reading text or watching something and getting the main idea or central idea out of that text is kind of a big life skill and something that he's going to need to do. If he's on the job and his boss tells him something or he listens to something, then he needs to get the main idea out of that. So I think that that's a pretty important one. So that's the social studies or history standard that I'm going to select. Now, this is assuming that he's going to determine the main idea from written text, that reading is critical to building knowledge about history and social studies. And my text is probably going to be related to social studies. Maybe it's government, maybe it's some history in the past, something hopefully I can tie in my student's interest. So for example, if he likes animals and he likes horses, and we're talking about history and how people used to come to the United States, how they used to travel in the United States, where the westward movement came all the way across for lots and lots of miles on a horse. So I might find a very simple text that explains that. Now, this standard is 6th through 8th grade. Now, but it's point 2. So if I'm going to trellis that all the way down, now it's a reading history text. So I'm going to go to reading informational text and find point 2. And this is a kindergarten standard, because remember, my student is really a non-reader right now. So primary, kind of getting his ideas across in a relatively simple text. Let's take a look at, see what that says. It says that that we, with prompts and supports, will identify the main idea and retell key details of the text. So this is better because it's oral. Now my student has limited oral communication skills, and he might have to use a yes and no. But you'll notice if you look at the corresponding college and career readiness anchor standard, it's the exact same standard. So we're working toward grade level standards, but I'm going to use a very simplified version of that text. Also going back to the 6th grade standard, it says to find the central idea of the information, and then the second part of that is to summarize. Don't think that you have to do the entire standard when you're looking at these standards. Sometimes the standard would take a 6-week period to teach a general education student. So pull out the key words, the key ideas, the most important things. I might go back and teach a student to summarize also, or to retell, like the kindergarten standard says, to retell it. If they have that oral communication, or if they can put, say, picture sequence in order of an event. Ordering events, another important idea that's related to history, but also related to their functional life, as they retell a story of something that happened to them, for example. So I love this application just to make things easy, but let's go back and see. This is the one that I settled on. Determine the central idea. Again, I'm only going to pick up that part of it for now. I'm not going to worry about summarizing the source distinct from prior knowledge. And I'm going to really simplify the idea a little bit. Okay, and this is another one that I thought would be great, gathering relevant information from multiple print or digital sources. When I see digital sources, I see internet, and he loves YouTube and he loves information. And using search terms, that means I get to plug in a term, and he gets to tell me a word that I'm going to look up on the internet. Again, a great activity that would be high interest for my particular student and for most of my class. All right, so if I'm going back to this standard, determine the central idea, the more simplified version is to determine the central idea or information of a primary or secondary source, and then it becomes, with prompts and supports, identify the main topic and details of the text. That becomes my standard that I'm going to be working toward. So it's toward the grade level standard, but it's trellised all the way down to a kindergarten standard. All right, so a simplified version. And here's my goal for the student. By May 2017, or whatever your time period is, given a social studies text that's read aloud, here's my accommodation to D, which is supported by visual images or a brief movie, also an adaptation based on his learning strength. He will answer yes and no questions about the text or select a visual representation about what the story was about from a field of 4. So given 4 different photos, he would pick out the one that was most about what the story was about, the key theme or key idea of that. All right, so there's multiple ways that he can show that he was engaged in the learning, all right, and getting the text. Now, the text should be simplified to a relatively simple language and not a very long text, because I know Dionisio can't attend for more than maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So it has to be relatively short, lots of visuals, and simplified to a certain degree. Okay? Now, the strategy that I would use with him was I would do direct instruction. I'm leading this activity. I'm going to teach him about some topic in history that hopefully he will find interesting. But I'm also going to break down that task using kind of an ABA or task analysis, break down this task that he needs to do into small steps, because sometimes I know those steps are hard for him. So here's just a kind of a general idea. D will 1, he has to listen to the title and the goal of the lesson. So I got to get him ready to listen to my story. So he's going to pay attention to me as I tell him, today we're going to be learning about how people used to travel in the United States and what's called the westward movement. Secondly, he's going to listen to a story and keep his eyes on the movie or on the visuals while he's listening for at least 3 to 5 minutes. Next, he would listen to the question about the story. He'd consider it, and he will answer questions related to the who, what, when, where, why about the text using a yes and no response. So that means I have to come up with some good questions that say, was this story about this? Yes or no? It might be better to do a choice card. So was this story about this or this? So that's where I'm going to probably have some teacher prepared picture cards. All right. So why would I select that instructional strategy over some of the other ones? It seemed to be the most natural fit. Task analysis is something that I'm comfortable with, and it enables me to see where he might be having trouble with attending to a story, listening, or is it related to the selection of it. All right. And then direct instruction, I'm going to be actually teaching him about a social studies concept, probably a simple one, but through a direct instruction that I'm guiding. It's not a discovery, it's not something else. So those are the 2 strategies that I selected. Now, this PowerPoint that I just created for you is very similar to the final product that you will be developing for me, the signature assignment number 4, where you put all of these things together. So some of the things that I've seen that were a little that I'm going to make a little adjustment to. Some of you, I think, kept the standard too big, and too many parts. So simplify that standard to just one goal or one objective, and go ahead and trellis down if you need to. If you're working on, say, fractions, a beginning idea for fractions for Deanie, so he would really struggle with fractions because he's still working on counting and adding basic objects, physical concrete objects. So even though my standard says he's going to be adding, multiply, dividing decimals, for example, I'm going to trellis that all the way down to a prerequisite skill, which is that he has to be able to count and add whole numbers before he can count or add decimals. So hopefully that makes some sense. I wanted to touch on a couple of things that a few of you did. Was a couple of you wrote how you would use each and every one of the instructional strategies for your objective. You didn't need to do that. You just need to select which instructional strategy or strategies, it could be more than one like I did here, would you use to teach that, and why. Some of you just listed one and didn't explain why, so in your fourth signature assignment be sure to include why. And if you can tell me a little about your student, that would help me understand how you trellis down to your goal, would be awesome. And goodness, I think that was it. Anyway, thanks.